Overcoming by Purefoy's Girl. Chapter 38. It was late when the coach turned onto the street toward Chelsea House, with the capital just waking up for the night all around them. The gas lamps cast their eerie soft glow on the world, a misty haze sparkling with moisture and mystery, but Will had no eye for its beauty. He sat gazing out of the window with solemn intensity, as if the force of his stare would carry him to Hannibal's side all the faster. It was a long ride back, a long time to think, a long time to feel his bond to Hannibal dim from piercing horror to something much worse, the settled and inescapable certainty that there was nothing more he could do. It made Will even more anxious to reach him, cursing the fact that he had left with so much unresolved between them. The coach pulled to a stop at last, and the weary footman jumped down to open the door. Winston leapt out, hastily relieving himself before Will could even exit the coach. "Try not to wake the staff if you can avoid it," Will said, tugging his heavy coat around him as he emerged into the cold, damp air. "The night watchman will let you in round back."
"Yes, my lord, we'll manage."
"Do you and your men have boarding you can seek?" Will asked, turning to the captain, and got a nod in return. "Have them charge the cost to Chelsea House and return once you've rested. My husband will expect I'll not try to be rid of you. He is remarkably persistent at times." He only hoped Hannibal's persistence would not keep him from seeing reason, and silently girded himself with his gift for what was to come. He drew a deep breath, mindful of Winston tugging on his lead, and quietly focused on the bond. It was muted, the turmoil simmering beneath a layer of exhaustion from a long day with too many unhappy turns, but it was much more faint than he'd ever felt it, even during their 6-year separation. Will reached for it, wishing he could soothe Hannibal through it, but he didn't know where to start. He feared the method of their attachment would prevent such a thing, and the thought was so dismaying he immediately set it aside. Squaring his shoulders, Will strode up to the front door where the night watchman was poised to admit him. He wondered what he would say when he was finally face to face with Hannibal, what he could possibly do that would sway him from the dangerous thinking he knew was going on. Even with such a long time to consider it along the way, he hadn't been able to compose a strategy other than presenting himself with honesty. He couldn't predict how Hannibal would react, couldn't predict what arguments he might use. He had to go in blind and hope for the best, relying on Hannibal's strong affection for him to bring him around. "Please let the others in through the back. I don't wish for the house staff to be disturbed."
"Very good, my lord."
The door unlocked from the inside, revealing Berger's face, lined with worry that immediately transformed to relief when he saw Will.
"You're a sight for sore eyes, my lord,"
the valet said, swinging the door wide to admit Will and Winston.
"You should be abed, Mr. Berger,"
Will softly scolded, drawing a deep breath of relief as he stepped inside Chelsea House. The familiar sense of wood polish and lemon oil washed over him, but no scent was more welcome than the earthy fragrance of Hannibal's alpha perfume.
"I couldn't, my lord,"
Berger said, voice hushed. He helped Will ease his coat off and took his gloves and hat, tidying everything as he spoke.
"He's in as sorry a mood as I ever did see him, and believe me, I've seen some sorry moods, my lord."
"Yes, Mr. Berger, I imagine you have,"
Will said, stooping to unclip Winston's lead. The dog immediately dashed off into the darkness in search of Hannibal, his nails clicking on the smooth floors.
"Where is he?"
"In the library, my lord. He's been scribbling away since his return. Wouldn't tell me what had happened, but I fear for him. Feel the gods must surely hear my prayers to send you back, my lord."
Will smiled at that and clasped his shoulder.
"Go on to bed now, Mr. Berger. I'll take care of his lordship."
"I know you will, my lord,"
Berger said, grateful and weary.
"I never worry over him too much when he's in your blessed hands. If you needs anything at all, ring me. When he's in a state I cannot sleep for love nor money."
"Well, do try," Will said, sending him off with a pat. "I'll see that he gets to bed and takes some rest." Will's footsteps were muted in the empty silence, his movements deliberate and slow as he moved through the darkness toward the library door. Winston whined, pawing at the panel as if reproaching Will for taking so long. Will ruffled his ears before he opened the door, smiling at how eagerly Winston ran within, shooting like a marksman's bullet toward the man seated before the bright fire. Will entered with more care, slowly, uncertain of Hannibal's mood, but always certain of his welcome. He was calm, deliberate, acting with the same control and concentration he felt when teasing a prize-winning trout from the water. He couldn't afford to rush this. He refused to watch everything between them snap free and go churning off into the waters of regret. He was going to change Hannibal's mind, and that was all there was to it. They would get through this, and they would do so together. Hannibal didn't look up at him. If he was surprised by Will's arrival, it certainly didn't show. He merely settled his hand on Winston's head to rub his ears, a gentle motion that set Winston's tail to wagging fiercely. Scribbling away seemed an accurate description for the paperwork spread over the library's massive desk. Will moved to inspect it, turning one of the sheets toward him and asking, "What have you been so busy working on, Hannibal?"
"Our separation agreement,"
Hannibal said, his voice a low, soft rumble, weighty with sorrow. He was actively pushing down on his emotions now that he knew about the bond, Will realized, dampening his feelings to keep Will from being affected by them. "A separation agreement," Will echoed, skimming some of the pages in the gloom, and seeing enough, quite enough indeed. He swept the papers together, forming a neat little stack that he busied himself arranging. "May I ask what prompted the sudden desire to sever yourself from me?"
"Please don't say it like that,"
Hannibal said, his words cracking on pain, on an indrawn breath as if Will had wounded him with only a question. "Like what?" Will asked, flattening his hand on the paper, the texture smooth and cold beneath his palm, the words beneath tiny black bars on a cage that sought to trap them both in something neither of them wanted.
"Like it is something painful,"
Hannibal whispered, sitting up to brace his elbows on his knees, his profile stark and stern.
"Severed, as if blood and tears follow."
"I feel as though they would," Will murmured, getting the tiniest twinge from his bond, a flare of upset quickly suppressed. "A piece of us both would be cut away by this, Hannibal. Is that truly what you want?" Winston yipped, worried by the slow rise in tension, his anxious dark eyes moving between the two most beloved people in his life. "Am I to have no say in this?" Will pressed, shoulders squared. He turned to pin Hannibal with his vivid blue eyes, the firelight picking out cerulean gleams from their indigo depths. "Isn't it always mine to choose?"
"Little did I know when I promised such as that I had taken all choice from you,"
Hannibal said. Tears sparkled in his eyes and thickened his voice, helpless evidence of how much this was costing him. "Who said that you ever did?" Will asked, his voice sharp with concern. He stayed there at the desk, one hand on the papers, blue eyes narrowed with growing affront. Hannibal turned, a shadow against the firelight, a shape divorced of visual cues Will relied on, his bond a mere fraction of connection.
"I made a place for Abigail at the cenobium,"
Hannibal said in a husky purr, the timbre of it soft and luxurious as silk even now.
"I was concerned we had not formed a bond during your heat. I sought counsel from the All-Mother Superior."
"You sought counsel regarding a bond from an unbonded Omega?" Will inquired, mouth thinning with displeasure to be told that Hannibal had marked the absence of their bond. And in true alpha form he'd said nothing, seeking to be educated rather than alarm Will. "And what other pearls of wisdom did they impart?"
"They told me of the reasons why an Alpha could not bond with an Omega, and spoke of circumstances so bitterly close to your own, I had no doubt in my mind why we could not,"
Hannibal said, his voice growing harsher with every word, every breath.
"A lifetime of violence at the hand of your father before finding yourself wed to me, and ground beneath my boot heel like some insignificant insect created the perfect conditions for a regrettable condition. An improper bond, they said. A thing bred of violence and ending in pain, binding an Omega to an Alpha they neither love nor need, but only fear."
Will's chin tipped up, his shoulders tight but straight, his back stiff as tempered steel as he bore the force of Hannibal's self-loathing.
"You had but one chance in your life to have something good,"
Hannibal said, stricken, horrified.
"And I stole it from you, by forcing you into a bond when you were little better than a child. And there is no hope of returning it. There is no hope of breaking it. I have taken your future from you fully and surely as your father has taken your past will. That is what they told me."
Light caught a tear as it welled from his eye, painting a streak of firelight over the high curve of his cheek.
"The bond to check a violent Alpha,"
he whispered, his voice distant as he reflected on it in all of its ugly meaning.
A bond to save yourself with no hope of reciprocation and no hope of escape. So yes, Will, I drew up a separation agreement. It is the least of what I should give you."
He turned to look at Will, the words pushed out of him with force, as if he could no more bear to say them than Will could bear to hear them.
"You've been forced to marry me, forced to bond with me, forced to bend yourself to my desires. I will not force you to live with me for the rest of your life. I owe you better than that."
"You certainly owe me better than to part me from you," Will said, tapping the papers. "I refuse to sign a single one of these. I adamantly reject what this person has told you, Hannibal. I do not fault their logic, only their understanding of something they have no experience of. I will not agree to any separation, no matter the terms."
"For all I know, you have no choice but to say such a thing,"
Hannibal said, blowing out a breath ripe with frustration and hurt. He dropped his head into his hands, ignoring Winston's anxious nudges.
"There is no way to know how deeply this affects you, how much of it is your own decision, how much is mine. Whether you choose for yourself or to please me—"
"Hannibal, you are in grave danger of saying something we will both regret," Will warned him, picking up the stack of papers and moving to settle across from him, somber and serious. "Please do not think you've tested even the surface of my violence, Lord Clarges. If you dare imply I am not in control of my own actions, I will show you how precisely just what I am capable of when I'm properly riled. Trust me, there is far too much at hand for you to risk my wrath." Hannibal was startled into looking up at him, shocked but silent. "This is just what I was afraid would happen when I realized you knew about my bond. I had to have the coach turn around midway back to Hartford and made myself seem a fickle fool to our staff, because I had no intentions of telling them that the lord they serve is an impulsive, determined man prone to making rash decisions." He tipped the papers in his hand in silent accusation. "Do you know why I came back?" he asked, lowering the papers, his eyes tracing the contours of Hannibal's face. He was always so beautiful to Will, but seemed even more so in this moment, the gleam of his cheekbones severe in the firelight, the firmness of his chin softened by shadows.
"Because of the bond?"
Hannibal asked, hoarse and harsh.
"Because I as good dragged you straight back to me like some monster from a fairy tale?"
"No. I came because I could feel how it hurt you, Hannibal. When you realized what had happened, all of your horror and self-loathing, all of your deep regret, I could feel it as if it was my own. Because that is what my bond to you does. It informs me, Hannibal." Hannibal's full mouth pressed into a strained line, and he looked away toward the fire, toward his thoughts, hiding in the shadows of his guilt and refusing to look past it. It was a familiar friend to him, Will knew. It was as comfortable and familiar a feeling to Hannibal as loneliness was to himself. "I came because I belong with you," Will quietly said, seeing Hannibal's shoulders tense. He watched the minute play of expressions on Hannibal's closed and distant face. "My place is with you, and our home is one another." Hannibal flinched, recalling the words he'd spoken, and how deeply he meant them, every syllable infused to his very soul. "I know you meant it when you said it to me," Will murmured, turning his own gaze to the fire, his words measured and soft. "I could feel it."
"Through the bond?"
Hannibal questioned, almost unable to get the words past the thickness in his throat. He lifted his head to face Will, his amber gaze fixing on his beautiful, beloved mate.
"The bond I forced you into. The bond you formed from sheer fright I would hurt you. The bond I terrorized you into."
"Yes," Will said, unable to deny it, unwilling to minimize it, and knowing that Hannibal wouldn't allow him to. He could only turn to hold Hannibal's wounded gaze and tell him, "Yes, that bond, Hannibal, the one I formed on the lane to Hertford Town almost 7 years ago, because I thought you were going to hurt me, because I was young and frightened and had heard you say you would arrange an accident to get rid of me, because I didn't know you then. Not like I do now." Hannibal stared at him, stricken.
"How can you bear to even look at me?"
he asked, the whisper harsh and horrified, so filled with shame that Will blinked against tears. His hand rose, pressing to his chest where Hannibal's bond lay like a brand against his soul. "Because it would break my heart not to. Because you have tried with everything in you to bring our shattered potential back together. just as you promised. Because when I was at my most vulnerable, you knelt before me, and you said I was your reason for being, and I always would be, Hannibal." Hannibal was still stiff and immovable as stone, a perfect statue with red-rimmed eyes and a face to make gods weep with envy of their creation. "Because there is a heart inside of you that beats just for me," Will said, trembling but determined. Of all the things that had passed between them, this time it was his turn, his chance to reach out, his chance to make assurances. "Because for the first time in my life, I am someone's treasure." Tears slipped from Hannibal's wide eyes, rivulets sweeping like a lover's fingers down his skin to cling to his jaw. "I am your treasure, Hannibal." Hannibal's mouth parted on an unsteady breath, and he looked away as if Will was something too precious to look upon, as if he didn't deserve to look upon him.
"You are,"
he said, his eyes flicking back to the papers in Will's lap.
"You are my treasure, Will. You always will be."
Will could feel the pressure looming behind those words, the certainty banking like the storm over Marsham in the height of his heat.
"And because I care so much for you, I will find a way to free you from what I've done,"
Hannibal said, a shudder of pure self-loathing running through him.
"You're right, of course. I've always said it is yours to choose, Will. I will find a way to make certain that the choice you make is truly yours, and not something born of this blasphemy I've forced on you."
"Is that truly what you think it is?" Will asked, a soft, patient smile curving his lips. Hannibal was determined to fight it, resisting the lure Will offered, bending his strength to bury himself in regret because to forgive himself was unthinkable. But Will was a good fisherman. He had patience and more. He had an unquenchable fire within him that this man had lit, as limitless and brilliant as the sun itself.
"Am I wrong to think so?"
Hannibal whispered, his hands clenching, one on his knee, the other at Winston's ruff. There was frustration and anger in his voice, but not for Will. Never for Will. Only for himself and the terrible things he had done. Will ached to wipe his tears away, to smooth his cheeks and hold him fast, to soothe him not as an Omega would an Alpha, but as a man would his husband, as equals in caring and affection.
"I've spent hours trying to imagine what it must be like for you to have such a bond,"
Hannibal said, his long throat working on a swallow.
"Forced to cater to my whims, connected to me by something you have no say in or power to break. I cannot even begin to grasp the least part of it. I think of you being held in such a state, pinned like a butterfly on display, and stripped of your choices."
He cut off, unable to finish, unable to force the words past his lips. "I can tell you what it's like," Will softly offered, smoothing the papers in his lap to keep his hands busy. "It isn't all that difficult, Hannibal. Just imagine that there is a cliff. It's a very tall cliff, pitched above the ocean, and you stand alone atop it." Hannibal's eyes slid to his face, his mind conjuring the towering, sharp edges of the wild northern cliffs, black and bleak and starkly beautiful. He saw Will there, wind buffeted with pink in his cheeks, a wild thing, half human and half magic, and so beautiful it could steal one's breath away. Now imagine that whenever you feel sad or frightened or lonely, something inside of you urges you toward the edge of the cliff. The closer you get, the more frightened you are, because you know that all that waits is a long drop and a painful, bloody end on sharp rocks. But the more frightened you are, the more you feel compelled to run toward it, because everything inside of you promises that in doing so you will find relief from your fears, from your loneliness, from your sadness. Hannibal flinched, his gut clenching with anxiety, inspired by those words, the image of Will atop the cliff filling him with terrible, sickening dread and horror. "So you keep moving toward it, even though you know very well what happens in the end," Will said, the bond suddenly more tangible, as if he had somehow broken down Hannibal's tight control of his emotions at last. "For nearly 7 years I lived in quiet terror that you would somehow discover it, that you would manipulate me through it. I thought that nature, in her arrogant ignorance, had burdened me with suicide of autonomy, that this unbreakable bond I have would urge me to fling myself from that cliff top and lose myself forever to the mindless obedience you once accused me of. Hannibal looked away again, unable to bear the image of it, his teeth clenching and his curled fist pressed to his mouth. It made me view myself through your eyes ever since that day, and for 6 long years I saw nothing. Will's face tightened with pain, the echoing remains of the past, a restless shadow on his heart. I would look into a mirror and see the room behind me, but not myself, only an empty space where a proper person should be. Hannibal flinched, scalded by it, a muffled sob escaping against his knuckles. How painfully wrong it was to take all the witty humor and wide-eyed bravery, all the heart and selfless grace of him, all the potential and hope and simple needs of a fragile human, and distill it into nothing. I was so frightened when you first returned, Will admitted with a quiet, rueful smile, blue eyes melancholy and soft. But then you saw me, Hannibal. After all that time, you finally saw me. Hannibal shuddered, dropping his head, appalled at the abhorrent cage he'd built around his husband, imprisoning him to wants and desires that were not his own, even now defending a man who had done nothing but harm him. You called me brilliant, Will said, and uttered a soft laugh, tears spilling over that he paid no mind to, happiness shining in his smile. You took me fishing and kissed me like I was something so rare and perfect, and you made me believe it was true.
It is true,
Hannibal said, drawing a breath that ached in his chest.
Every word of it is true.
I know it is, Will said, feeling a trickle of pain through his bond, Hannibal's control loosening just a fraction more. I know you spoke the truth, because that is what my bond to you does, Hannibal. Your pleasure, your happiness, your concerns, I feel them in all their strength. That is what it does. That is all it does. It took a long, painful moment for Hannibal to lift his face, for him to meet Will's eyes, a small spark of hope lighting a golden gleam within. It took me some time in quiet reflection, which I had plenty of on my mad dash back to keep you from doing something precisely this impulsive, Will said, dropping a meaningful look at the papers in his lap. But I came to the conclusion that there has never been a moment where the bond I formed to you has swayed me to take actions or make decisions against my own desires. The cliff I was so frightened of was nothing more than my own reservations and uncertainties that you daily laid to rest with your devoted affections. Hannibal wet his lower lip, wiping at his face again, his other hand moving in Winston's ruff, seeking comfort. Will countered his upset with calm, allowing the anxiety and horror and pain in Hannibal's bond to wash through him, trying to draw it into him like venom from a wound and cast it out of them both. He did it with deliberate purpose, testing his ability to use the bond to their mutual advantage and soothe his husband so that they could solve this. It was no small triumph for him to see Hannibal's shoulders loosen, to watch the tightness of his features ease, to know that so much more was possible than either of them had allowed for. "Consider this, Hannibal," Will murmured, his tears drying on his cheeks, salt sparkling on his skin like a glimmer of stardust. "When Winston ran, and I chased him, did you not wish with everything in you I would stop, that I would heed you?" Hannibal frowned, struggling against Will's calm, soft reason. "When I fled to the Hobbs house with you shouting after me, do you think you wouldn't have stopped me in my tracks if the bond works as you believe, even without you knowing it?" Will offered, watching the realization sinking in. "Were you able to control me in the slightest way through my bond to you, Hannibal, I highly doubt you would have been slapped in the face with a fish or threatened with a marquetry table." It brought a sad, rueful smile to Hannibal's lips, reluctant and soft. He was finally able to meet Will's eyes, the effort Herculean.
"Why did you withdraw from me?"
Hannibal whispered, his grip on his emotions slipping even more, anguish atop of horror and blanketed in firm determination to make things right. Will took it all, willing to wade through the darkness to find the light he knew awaited him.
"This was what you wanted to tell me, wasn't it? What you feared to speak of?"
Will nodded, fingers absently brushing over the papers, fiddling with a folded corner as he thought. Yes, it was. And I pulled away from you for the same reasons you drew up these horrid papers, Hannibal. Because I, like you, am prone to making rash decisions and attempting to fix things on my own. We are two stubborn creatures on that count, Lord Clarges. His large, expressive eyes held Hannibal's, a world of understanding and vast affection in every flickering glimmer. I did it because I was worried you might suffer from my lack, he said, with too much to lose to cater to shyness, too much at stake to turn away now. I did it because I realized then that I care for you too much to trap you where you cannot be whole. Hannibal jerked as if slapped, his head snapping back toward the fire, grief rising between them that was not all his own, not entirely. But I find I am greedy, Will whispered, willing Hannibal to look at him, rewarded with the slow turn of his head and the piercing intensity of his gaze. I am selfish, every bit as selfish as an alpha, Hannibal. I asked myself if I was willing to sacrifice your future happiness for my own, and when I felt you discover the bond, I had my answer. Hannibal held his breath, his heart pounding so hard in his chest it nearly deafened him, every fiber in his being attuned to the words his husband spoke. I am willing, Hannibal, Will said, gentle self-reproach in the curve of his sad smile. When faced with the idea of being parted from you, I am more selfish than any alpha who has ever lived. Will, Hannibal whispered, the painful yearning of his heart distilled down into a single name that drew the boundaries of his joy. Will, a match so entirely suited to him that no other could ever compare. It is mine to choose, Hannibal, Will said, every line of his body soft with ease, welcoming, accepting no influence of his one-sided bond, but simply him, simply his loving, beautiful heart. I chose to give us a chance to be a family. I chose to unlock that door and share my heat with you. I chose to come to you in this moment, just as I choose to sit here for as long as it takes to make you understand. I will not allow what has happened in the past to return and wound me yet again. I refuse to give it that power, Hannibal. I simply won't stand for it. A long silence fell, broken only by the soft snap and pop of the logs burning down on the fireplace.
How am I to live with knowing what I've done to you?
Hannibal finally asked, a heartbroken whisper that bordered on a plea.
That when you make your decision and find someone deserving of you, you will never be able to bond with them because of my actions.
The same way I will live with knowing that I may never bear children because of the choices I made. And they were my choices, Hannibal, Will said, cutting him off before he could speak. I'm not excusing what happened. I'm not even sure if I'm forgiving it. I wouldn't know how to start. But I cannot change what happened, and I have accepted it, Hannibal. It's a part of me now, for better or worse. Hannibal stared at him, a world of questions in his amber eyes, his strong hands trembling, all of his alpha strength shaken to its foundations by a lone omega with limpid blue eyes and a depth of understanding he never expected and never deserved. I told you before, there are things which cannot be mended, Hannibal. There is no moving backwards, and time does not reverse. Teacups remain shattered, words remain spoken, and everyone lives with the consequences as they must. We will live with those consequences because we are both made of stronger stuff than a teacup. Hannibal gazed at him with such deep devotion that Will's eyes misted all over again, a tremor running through his slender frame, their future hanging in the balance, trembling on a knife's edge just waiting to be cut in two.
Do you still see yourself through my eyes, Will?
Hannibal asked, the words barely heard over the crackle of the fire. Yes, I do, Hannibal. I see myself as you see me, every bit of me the treasure that you hold. He stood, papers in hand, and moved to the fire. Crouching, he picked up the first sheet and fed it to the flames, murmuring, I see myself in your delight when you look at me. He picked up the next, a decree settling an obscenely generous annuity on Will for the remainder of his life. I see myself in the way you grin when you find me clever, he whispered, and sent it floating into the licking fire. When I feel at my most ugly and vulnerable, I see myself transformed as you whisper with awe that I am beautiful. He plucked up another sheet, the flames flaring brighter as it consumed the heavy paper. I see myself as someone who inspires you to be someone I never dreamed could exist solely for my sake, Will said, committing another wall between them to ash. I am known and cherished from the tips of my curls to the curl of my toes, Hannibal. Something even my imagination never dared hope for. Another page, and another, line after line, parceling Hannibal's worldly goods out for the happiness he hoped to give Will in place of himself. I see myself as I see you, Hannibal, he said, looking over at him, the sheer longing in Hannibal's eyes nearly undoing him. Tormented by a past we have no way to change, but determined to suffer in silence, determined to spare those we hold most dear. Will, we are finite in flesh, but limitless in spirit, wounded but rising above it, Will told him, delivering another piece of paper to its fiery death. We are stubborn and proud and flawed, but we are trying, Hannibal. We may not have gotten it right the first time, but there's no reason for us to ever stop trying. He calmly gave the last paper to the fire, Hannibal's letter to grandfather, requesting his permission to dissolve their union on the grounds of irreparable personal and emotional harm done, stating that Hannibal was unfit to continue as Will's husband. We are just alike, you and I, Will murmured, watching the fire eat it all away, wishing he could so easily erase the barriers that parted them. When there is some issue where we are at fault, we move to minimize the damage to those we care most for. It is all too easy for us to forget that those we seek to protect may be harmed to a greater degree by our decision not to involve them. He turned and fixed his blue eyes on Hannibal. I chose not to speak of the bond, first from fear, and then from hope. Hope that in the depths of my heat what we felt for one another would somehow overcome it. When it did not, I held my silence out of my desire to spare you, Hannibal, just as you desire to spare me. But I do not wish to be spared, and it occurred to me that you might not wish to be spared either. He rose, a solid shadow framed by firelight as he moved to take Hannibal's hand in his. The touch was gentle, as reverent of him as Hannibal had ever been of Will himself. I am rich in treasure with you, Will said, whispering back to him those words he'd spoken in the warmth of their bed, when they'd been tied together by so much more than just a knot of flesh. Should every fortune I have reverse, I could withstand the pain of it if only I have you near me. Hannibal's fingers clenched on his, a tremor of reaction, a reflexive response that preceded the rise of tears in his amber eyes. His large frame shuddered with the force of his emotions as he brought Will's hand to his lips, holding it fast in both of his own to lay warm kisses on his knuckles, to press it to his face where tears rolled hot against Will's skin. I need no bond to complete me, Will whispered, stroking his hair, the soft strands feathery and fine against his gentle fingertips. By my own completion, I know you, Hannibal Lecter. Those amber eyes swept up to his, glistening and full, as Will said, and with you I am complete. Hannibal rose from the chair in a whirlwind of scent and heat and desperation, aching pain sweeping Will half off of his feet with the strength of his affection.
Promise me you will never forgive me, he begged, squeezing Will to him with the frantic urgency of a man certain he will lose everything he holds dear. Swear to me, Will, you will never allow me to forget what I have done to you.
I would never make such a promise, Will told him, kneading his nape, his strong arms just as forceful. His relief left him shaken, trembling with released tension. He had counted on the strength of Hannibal's feelings for him, and he had not been disappointed. It was not the last of it, but it was the worst of it, and they clung together all the stronger for so nearly being torn apart. Not when I know that you will never forgive yourself, Hannibal, Will said, the emptiness that had overcome him on his way back now filled with his mate, as it should be. There is no punishment or retribution I could dream of that would rival what you inflict on yourself for my sake, and I have no interest in your suffering, only in your happiness." He eased back just enough to bring his hand to rest on Hannibal's cheek, the shadow on his heart chased away by the caring and devotion so evident in his husband's expression. "Life is never fair, and rarely what we have earned, but I would much rather promise you that I will forgive you than be sworn to a promise I know I cannot keep," he whispered, smoothing Hannibal's tears away at long last. He tipped his head and kissed the corner of Hannibal's eye, the delicate skin soft beneath his lips, another warm tear tracing the seam of his mouth. He kissed it away, the salty flavor lost to the sweetness of its meaning. He kissed his closed lids and the high slopes of his cheeks over and again, until Hannibal stilled in his arms, warm and solid, and calmed by his soft ministrations. "The mirror is no longer empty, Hannibal. I see myself through your eyes and find that there is someone beautiful and irreplaceable looking back at me," Will whispered, kissing his forehead and the tip of his nose, kissing the corners of his mouth, and finally resting against him, nuzzling him, needing to touch him. "Don't thrust me back into the bleakness that I knew before your return. Keep your word, and help me bring our shattered potential back together again."
"If it takes the rest of my life, I will never stop trying,"
Hannibal breathed, leaning his forehead against Will's, his hand smoothing Will's back, his grip no less strong, but gentle and loving.
"It is always yours to choose, Will."
The bond swelled inside of him like a second heartbeat, pounding in time with Will's own, each reverberation stronger than the one before it. It was the sweet sound of a waltz all their own, the music of a love uniquely theirs, the harmony tuned for their ears alone. Will's lids lowered, his blue eyes nearly black beneath the sweep of his lashes. He drew the strength of Hannibal's affection around him like a shield, wrapping himself in it, plunging himself deep without reserve. The kiss he pressed to Hannibal's lips tasted of victory, of a battle fought hard and won, and he claimed his prize with a soft coaxing purr half smothered against Hannibal's firm lips. Hannibal answered it with a rumbling chuff, the alpha in him rising to heed the call of the omega he belonged to. "I want you, Hannibal," Will breathed, cupping his face to kiss him breathless, needing to return the strength of his feelings in full, to show him that though all was not forgiven nor forgotten, it was not enough to stand in the way of what they shared. "In all your tenderness and strength and earnest efforts, I want you. Show me that you want me too." Hannibal felt it, sensed it. He needed no bond to tell him, no mystical connection to grant him insight into Will's heart. Others loved fully without it, and he would see to it that Will never suffered the lack, that he was loved so thoroughly and so deeply that he had no time to wonder what might have been had they come together as nature intended, and not as the evils of man had determined. They would feed their little flame until it swelled to a raging inferno, fusing them together in a way a bond never could. What hope had something so routine when faced with what they had weathered? What could it possibly offer when what they shared had been tempered and beaten and folded together as armor for a war? They had one another, flawed but trying, overcoming their hurdles time and again, and refusing, always refusing, to be spared. When it came to loving and being loved, it would always be worth the cost.
"I am yours,"
Hannibal whispered, returning Will's kisses with growing heat, half afraid to touch him, certain that he would vanish like smoke, removed far beyond his reach for the long, lonely length of his life.
"God alone knows why you would want me, but I am wholly and entirely yours, Will."
He opened his eyes, turning his face against Will's hand to nuzzle his wrist, scenting the delicate webbing of blue veins beneath the tender surface of his skin.
"I am yours to choose,"
he breathed, kissing the soft throb of his pulse, turning to press another light sucking kiss against his other wrist.
"I am yours to command, to do as you please."
He nuzzled his nose against Will's, cradling him close, relishing the pleasure of Will's warm, firm hands against his cheeks.
"I would kneel at your feet every day of our lives and give thanks to the gods to be blessed with you,"
he said, his mouth brushing Will's with every soft movement of his lips.
"The only hell I can imagine is a life without you, Will. How empty and meaningless it would be."
He kissed Will's full lips, a bare brushing touch of mouths, breath drawn as breath, sweet with the promise of what could be, of what truly was.
"Anything you could ever ask of me, I would do for only the pleasure of your smile,"
Hannibal whispered, lids fluttering when the tip of Will's tongue traced the plump curve of his lower lip.
"Cut me, and I bleed the blue of your eyes by moonlight. Look into the fabric of my soul, and you will find your name branded there. Listen to my heart, and you will hear its rhythm beat your name."
"Hannibal," Will whispered, kissing him once and again, hands sweeping down his shoulders to grasp the firm muscle of his arms, his heart singing in his chest.
"I am yours,"
Hannibal said again, fiercely, insistently.
"I swear by all the gods' will, I am yours and yours alone. If not forever, then for as long as you will have me."
Will twined his arms around Hannibal, and he gave him a gentle tug, sinking to the floor together before the fire, mouths meshed and bodies trembling. Winston whined and retreated to the library door, unmarked by either of them. There was no room to spare attention when every touch was a miracle, revered for its welcome. Will didn't feel the soft weave of the handmade carpet beneath him, nor the ache of bruises still tender from the passion of his heat. All he felt was the warmth of Hannibal against him, the soft rush of his heated breath, the gentle urgency of hands that touched him as they sat in a jumble of long legs and taut clothing. He found Hannibal's neckerchief and tugged it, unknotting it to drag it free. There was no hesitance in the way he pushed his nose beneath Hannibal's jaw, filling his lungs with his mate's thick alpha scent, one hand curling around Hannibal's nape to hold him fast. Hannibal chuffed softly, approval heavy in the deep rumble of it, even as he stripped Will's neckerchief off in turn. Heaven was the scent that reached him, hot and sweet and ripe with fertility that had not faded since Will's heat. He tipped his head, baring more of his throat for Will's gentle scenting, filling every sense with the perfection of his mate. The urgency of heat and rut had satiated their bodies, but this slow and languid scenting fed much deeper hungers than even that. There was a flavor to each of the other, a subtle blend of their scents that was intoxicating. They tasted it in slow, lingering kisses, pulled it over teeth and tongue to feel it burst into greedy lungs. It was the scent of Alpha and Omega made one, the perfume of family and the fragrance of home that had nearly been lost to them both. Will tipped his chin up and turned, offering the other side of his long throat, where the mark lay. Hannibal's lips brushed over it, gentle against his healing skin, but the rub of his sharp alpha fangs was unmistakable, and Will shuddered, whispering soft encouragement. He had a brief, fleeting thought about locking the door, or moving to either of their rooms where very comfortable beds were ready to hold them. But Hannibal's long fingers swept beneath the heavy material of his jacket to pluck the buttons of his waistcoat, and Will promptly abandoned any such notion. The last thing on earth he wanted in this moment was to pull away from Hannibal's seeking touch, from the gentle hunger and the kisses being rained on his neck. The waistcoat gaped with the final button, and Hannibal leaned back only enough to strip both jacket and waistcoat from him, his amber eyes fastened on Will's. The moment his arms were free, Will cupped his face, tipping forward to kiss him again, the slow stroke of tongue against tongue building a warmth inside him that his heat couldn't hold a candle to. Each slide of lips was an homage, each light press of sharp teeth was a prayer, each gentle suck silent adoration that was returned with fervor.
"Will,"
Hannibal whispered, cupping the corded thigh that had somehow worked over his hip, the shift and tug of their bodies bringing them as close as sitting would allow. He traced the muscle beneath the fine material of Will's pants, feeling it shift and tighten as his hand slid up to rest at Will's hip. He breathed his name over and over, allowing Will to strip his waistcoat from him. His pocket watch slid out onto the floor, the chain and Will's garter ribbon bright against the dark weave of the carpet. A soft purr of laughter escaped when Will saw it, but the laughter quickly turned to a low gasp when Hannibal framed his slim waist with both hands, sliding his shirt free of his pants.
"Kiss me,"
Hannibal whispered, husky and urgent. He fumbled blindly to tug Will's boots free, fighting to draw the fitted leather from his long foot. Will's mouth touched his in a teasing, feather-light kiss, even as his long fingers rapidly undid the buttons on Hannibal's shirt. He pressed his palms to his husband's broad chest, curling his fingers into the thick, crisp hair dusted with silver. He ran his hands up to Hannibal's broad shoulders, slipping the fine shirt down his arms and off. Hannibal snared it where it tucked into his pants and jerked it free, tossing it into a heap with their other clothing.
"I should carry you upstairs,"
he said, breathing against Will's lips, seeking more of those light, teasing kisses. "Not in this state," Will whispered back, leaning back on his hands to bend his knee up, brows lifted. Hannibal grinned, obeying the silent request. He reached for Will's other boot and slid it from him, flinging it away in favor of grasping Will's heel. He shaped Will's slender ankle with his hands, sweeping the hard muscle of his calf up to the hem of his pants. "You've dropped your armor, Hannibal," Will said, casting a glance at the garter ribbon on the floor. "Be wary of what you might find lying in wait for you."
"A gleeful and more joyous death than any man has a right to,"
Hannibal murmured, bending to kiss Will's knee, his hand sliding up Will's inner thigh to cup his leg, squeezing the firmness of his thigh just to feel the solid weight of him.
"With my last sight on earth that of the world's most perfect knees."
He tugged Will's leg over his hip, releasing his thigh to find the fastenings of his pants. The loose tails of Will's shirt draped down to shield him as the buttons were undone, the soft cloth of his underthings keeping him modestly covered. He was quickly divested of both, his husband uncoiling from him to drag Will's pants and underclothes off of him. The nap of the carpet prickled his firm backside, and Will shifted, tugging the tail of his shirt beneath him. Hannibal tossed Will's things to land with the others and turned back, his mouth parting on a low gasp as he stared at his mate, his white stockings stark against the pearly expanse of his thigh, his plain black garter ribbons tied firmly at his knees, his half-undone shirt throwing shadows over his slender belly.
"Gods in heaven,"
Hannibal said, voice raspy with desire, raw with his need to love Will with everything in him.
"Your knees are no indication of how dangerous you truly are, Will."
"Then I will strive not to wound you, Hannibal," Will offered, bending his knee up to untie the black garter just above the shapely turn of his leg. Hannibal stayed his hand, smoothing his fingers over the ribbon.
"Leave them,"
he said, a flush warming his high cheeks at the suggestion.
"Wound me, Will. There is no pain too great I would not suffer it for your touch."
Will blushed, but did as Hannibal desired, and left his stockings in place, shivering when his husband's sensitive hands slid over his knees in brief appreciation. The fire was warm at his back as Hannibal drew away, only long enough to shed his own clothing, leaving his pants in place just in case Will might not wish for more. It was always his choice, and in a lifetime bereft of such a luxury, Will clung to the surety of that promise with every bit of his heart, loving Hannibal all the more for his sincerity. Hannibal plucked the decorative brocade lap blanket up from the back of the settee and turned to kneel, easily scooping Will into his arms, his mate's husky, surprised laughter music to his ears.
"A certain someone would never forgive me for tumbling you about on carpets,"
he whispered, holding Will in his lap while he spread the blanket out before the fire, his mate's delectable backside a firm weight aching against his groin.
"I won't ask who,"
Will whispered, kissing him so that Hannibal forgot what he was about, his hand sliding up Will's body in awed exploration. His laughter was gruff and halfway a groan when Will purred,
"For fear that we might lose our opportunity."
"I don't think even my meddling relatives could make a dent in my appreciation for you just now, Will,"
Hannibal said, easing down onto the blanket to lay Will before him, his dark curls a spill of ink against the blanket, his slender, sturdy body a masterpiece of supple beauty, wrapped in a thin blouse and clad in snowy stockings.
"To think how close I've come to losing you, Will. So many times, for so many reasons."
"You haven't lost me, Hannibal. I'm here, right where I belong."
Will smiled up at him and opened his arms in unspoken invitation. The love shining in Hannibal's eyes brought tears to his own, and he drew his husband down to him, into the strong circle of his embrace, firm against the body he found so perfect in every way, deep into the heart that had prepared this tender place for the whole of his life, waiting so anxiously for the right person to fit. And that person was Hannibal, his flawed but earnest husband, who would spend every waking moment in relentless pursuit of Will's happiness simply because he cared.
"What are you thinking of?"
Hannibal asked, draping at his side with leonine grace, his elbow braced and his cheek resting in his hand as he gazed down at Will. He trailed his other hand over the long column of Will's throat, finding the dip of his collarbones to caress the soft skin there. "How glad I am I turned the coach around," Will answered, sighing when Hannibal's hand curved against his throat, warm and weighty and loving. He turned his head just slightly to look up at his husband before tugging Hannibal's hand from his throat to his mouth. He kissed the salty skin of his palm, kissed each calloused fingertip in turn, smiling when Hannibal couldn't resist the urge to trace Will's kiss-wet lips as he did so. "How glad I am that I can be sensible enough for the both of us, and we are here now, dangerous knees and meddlesome relatives notwithstanding." Hannibal chuckled, trailing his fingers down Will's cheek to caress his jaw. He leaned over him, capturing Will's mouth in another brushing kiss that quickly deepened.
"How does it always end up that when I set out to rescue you,"
Hannibal said, fingers sliding down Will's throat to spread over the bared skin of his chest, pressing where his heart pumped a gentle rhythm against his palm,
"you end up rescuing me instead?"
"I suppose you're just lucky," Will suggested, a slight wriggle shifting Hannibal's hand over just a small stretch beneath his open shirt to lay on the gentle curve of his breast. "Both of us are."
"Aren't we just?"
Hannibal agreed, cupping the small mound of Will's breast in the heat of his hand, his mouth whispering kisses over the stubborn tuck of Will's chin, over the fullness of his lower lip up to the tip of his adorable nose. Will covered Hannibal's hand with his, flattening it against the tender peak of his nipple, the material of his shirt a silky barrier between his hand and the heat of Hannibal's own.
"Every time I touch you is like the first time,"
Hannibal purred, running his thumb over Will's nipple until it tightened, a hard pebble of delectable pink begging for lips and tongue to worship it. But he kissed Will's lips instead, teasing that stiff point with slow sweeps of his thumb, catching it in a soft pinch that made Will's back arch, hips tilting in invitation.
"Every inch of you is a mystery I solve anew, each time rewarded in excess of the time before."
Will caught Hannibal's lower lip in his teeth, sucking softly, nibbling his way into a deeper kiss to feel the slick, velvety touch of his tongue. The slow, methodical tug on his nipple shot straight to his groin, his firm flesh rising up against his belly, straining for a touch. The whisper of cloth over his sensitive skin was a tease of sensation, too light to do anything more than stoke the fire. Hannibal gave Will one final tug and kissed his way down his throat, moving to undo the remaining buttons on Will's shirt. The ruddy darkness of his large nipples tinting the material of his fine shirt was too much temptation, and Hannibal darted his tongue out to coil around one swollen point. He suckled Will through the fabric, exposing more and more of his slender body as the buttons were undone. Will bit his lip, his half-lidded eyes fastened on the sight of Hannibal paying rapturous attention to his flesh. The draw of his mouth was almost painful in the pleasure it brought him, each rub of Hannibal's tongue coaxing him to exquisite hardness. Hannibal bit him ever so softly, raking the material of the shirt away with his sharp teeth to bare his wet skin to cool air. The sudden chill was countered by the hot, wet mouth closing over him, and Will moaned, liquid with pleasure, needing Hannibal's nape to urge him on. His breath came out in a stuttering gasp when the last button was undone, and Hannibal's fingers lightly skimmed over the fluttering planes of his belly.
"You're always so careful with me,"
he breathed, tugging Hannibal's hair to raise his head for another kiss, blanketing himself in alpha strength and weight. He twined his arms around Hannibal's back, smoothing his skin and caressing him, tracing the rough places where his nails had scored deep, testament to the passion Hannibal could wake in him.
"I fear I am not so careful with you."
"Any pain is worth it,"
Hannibal reminded him, eyes closing when Will swept his hands over his sides, fingers slipping beneath the loosened waist of his pants. He hissed in surprise when Will set his nails in his backside, firmly cupping him, and grinned as amber eyes slit open. Will stroked the sting away, opening for his husband's hungry kisses. He gave Hannibal's backside another lusty squeeze, and rubbed his hands up the small of his back. His husband was silky and warm against him, settling against Will with a throaty alpha purr rumbling through his wide chest. Will curled his fingers in the ditch of Hannibal's spine, a soft moan escaping him to vividly recall the powerful flex and shift of his husband's body surging into him. Hannibal swallowed his moan, laving Will's mouth with his tongue, shuddering as Will's fingers fought the fastenings on his pants with sudden urgency. He shifted, trying to make room without losing Will's sweet mouth in the process. A too hasty tug ripped fastenings free, buttons skittering over the carpet to be wandered over later by the staff. But for now, Hannibal didn't care. The moment there was room enough. Will drew the fastenings on his underthings and shoved it all down over his lean hips. There was a keenly Omegan pleasure in seeing Hannibal rear back to shove the offending cloth off, in watching the beautiful, supple strength of his tawny body as he moved. Will lay back, panting and surprised by the strength of his own desires, as Hannibal came to him by firelight, a dangerous beast with heavy fangs and a hungry mouth, eager to devour him. Hannibal knelt between Will's feet, staring down at him for a long, absorbed moment. Will was flushed and tousled, his shirt spread beneath him and clinging to his shapely biceps. His pert little breasts heaved with every breath, their large tips tight and straining. The way that his slim waist dipped into the slight curve of his hips, framing the hard length of his sex, was nearly enough to unman him entirely. "Hannibal," Will whispered, sliding his legs against Hannibal's hips, the silky stockings brushing against him, waking a responsive pulse in his heavy sex. Will cocked his head, a slight smile curving his lips when Hannibal seized him by his calf and kissed his knee, rubbing his cheek along the smooth material of his stocking, and higher, laying kisses up Will's thigh. Will's eyes fluttered nearly closed, and his breath left him on a deep, delighted sigh as Hannibal pushed his legs wider, his hot breath steaming over Will's skin. The spill of it against his small slit made him shudder, his hands clenching into fists. Hannibal coiled between his legs and kissed him there on those small, full lips swollen with desire and veiling the tight heat of him. His husband was not to be denied. Gently, with cautious care for the toll Will's heat had taken on him, Hannibal teased his way inside Will's body, his lapping tongue a small warning of what would surely follow. He suckled and plumbed the heat of Will's body with no thought beyond bringing him pleasure, laving there with kisses as he feasted on the sweet, meaty flavor of his mate's tight body. Will stretched beneath his touch, luxuriating in it, hardly aware when his own heaving breath became soft, raspy cries. He wanted to close his eyes and savor it, but he was greedy for the sight of Hannibal working his way higher, greedy for the flash of amber eyes that caught and held his as Hannibal dragged his tongue up the quivering stretch of Will's eager sex, a trail of sensation that was electric in its intensity. He rocked his hips in restless encouragement, primed and ready, and needing his husband. He could see by the swollen, dripping state of him that Hannibal needed him just as badly in return, and ached to bring his husband the same pleasure he was feeling. But Hannibal swallowed him down in one practiced, fluid motion, and Will cried out, all rational thought lost to the exquisite delight of being engulfed in tight, wet heat. Hannibal's strong hands cupped his backside, lifting him, controlling his wriggling with difficulty as he caught a rhythm, drawing up and plunging down at a pace Will could not resist. He arched up hard, spots dancing before his eyes as he pulled taut in a breathless arc of pleasure. It snapped like a string wound too tightly, every nerve in his body firing with the force of his release. He sobbed, thrusting against Hannibal's sucking mouth until he had nothing left to give. He slumped back on the blanket, trembling and spent, belatedly loosening the clench of his thighs around his husband's head. Hannibal was reluctant to stop. He kept suckling until Will was soft and wriggled in protest before finally letting him slide free. Will was warm and yielding as Hannibal slid over him, folding around him, tucking up tightly to his body. He felt small and delicate beneath him, a coveted, protected treasure meant to be kissed with tenderness and delight. He cradled his husband in turn, thighs falling open at the first wet kiss of Hannibal's swollen head against his slit. Hannibal arched over him, grazing kisses down Will's sternum, golden eyes closed in delight as he eased deeper. Will stroked his hair, his nape, gliding his hands over Hannibal's shoulders as that thick, engorged flesh spread him open. The taut expectation of discomfort gave way, and he softened around Hannibal's gentle pushes, wet and willing and responsive to every teasing press and retreat. "Hannibal," Will moaned, tugging at him, his stocking-clad legs lifting to Hannibal's hips, strong thighs and equally dangerous calves gripping him from haunches to thigh to pull him closer. Hannibal resisted the pull, working himself deeper in a slow, steady rhythm that made Will's toes curl against him.
"I thought I would never be able to touch you this way again,"
Hannibal whispered, finally settling against him. He swept one arm up beneath Will's shoulders and arched over him, mouths meeting in a deep and aching kiss.
"I thought I had lost you forever."
"I'm here," Will said, half a moan in his husband's mouth. He coiled his arms round Hannibal's neck to hold him close enough that there was no space between them, welcoming the pleasant weight that settled against him. He rocked his hips up, his wet sex pressed against the firm softness of Hannibal's furry belly, nipples teased by the hair on his chest. "I'm right where I belong." It brought Hannibal to sudden motion against him, but even in this he was careful, considerate of the toll Will's heat had taken on them both. It was gentle and slow but deep, each rolling pulse to reach all the sensitive places that needed his touch. It was a different pleasure than having Hannibal's mouth on him, a deeper kind of sensation that made him shudder with looming orgasm, and with every rub of their bodies together, Will knew he would have both in short order. It was slow and deliberate, each moment hoarded for the pleasure it brought. They moved as one, bodies rippling together, unhurried in their enjoyment of one another. Pleasure built between them in breathless whispers, until their kisses grew more frantic, less lingering, and more demanding. Hannibal's raspy, husky moans matched Will's softer cries, echoing in the quiet room. Hannibal's knot began to fill, a plump ring that caught in Will's slit with each short thrust, in a burst of sensation from the little nerve bundles eager to embrace it. "Hannibal," he said, moaning his name over and over again, tangling his fingers in his husband's fine hair, risking his soft lips to those sharp teeth, but not caring if he bled. Pleasure coiled like a spring inside of him, dangerous and vibrating with tension, needing only the barest touch to send it bursting out of control. Hannibal groaned, squeezing Will to him, one hand failing to sweep his hip to the bend of his knee. He caught him there, hitching Will's leg up higher over his hip, opening him more fully for his growing knot. But the stalking did him in. That silky, smooth stalking over his dangerous knee, sliding against Hannibal's naked skin. His fingers spread where the garter ribbon was tied fast, touching hot skin and velvety ribbon and slippery stocking all at once, and his knot filled in earnest.
"God's will,"
he moaned, hunkering over him to plunge deep, trying to restrain himself but unable to resist the siren call of his young mate's body. His other hand slipped beneath Will's back to clutch him close, gripping the smooth curve of his shoulder in sudden frenzy. Panting, Will hitched his other leg up and rolled his hips, a harsh sob of pleasure escaping him when his husband sank deep, knot swelling so full it tested the boundary between pleasure and pain. Hannibal dropped over him, a blanket of musky alpha scent and warm flesh and gentle kisses. His flanks tightened, seeking the tie that would bind them, and Will captured his knot with a keening moan. He was senseless with the pleasure of it, squeezing down around Hannibal's knot to rhythmically milk it, every ripple of his body feeding shocking sensation through him. He undulated beneath his husband's weight, teeth clenching when the first flood of seed brought an answering spasm of ecstasy from his own sex, a dribble of seed pooling between the press of their bellies.
"God's will, how I love you,"
Hannibal breathed, naming it at long last, the gentle whisper of it almost sliding past Will's awareness, but not past the bond. He caught his breath on a surprised sob, and clung tightly to Hannibal's shoulders, wondering if he had misheard him, knowing he hadn't. It woke such a profound feeling in answer that Will trembled from it, frightened and elated and entirely filled with joy. Hannibal slid both arms beneath him to gather him up, legs tucking to form a ball of flesh pressed tightly together, locked as much in spirit as in body. He rained kisses over Will's jaw, over his throat, scenting him and nipping him, groaning with each pulse of his hips as pleasure racked them both. It was a slow but fierce climax, like water spilling over a dam after a storm, a culmination of too much pressure finally given release.
"My heart, my treasure, my love,"
Hannibal whispered, all thoughts of shielding Will from his bond temporarily lost to the beauty of this moment, his deepest emotions bared for his mate's connection to him. He cradled Will's head in his hand, the other falling to cup the slight sway of his back, that distracting curve that balanced the ripe fullness of his backside with the perfect stretch of his shoulders.
"My beautiful, wonderful beloved."
Will blinked back tears, but they rose despite it, the bond flooding him with how deeply Hannibal cared for him, with the pleasure he felt, a pleasure they shared, as their bodies did what nature had designed them to do. The sharpness of it faded slowly, dying like the firelight as the logs burned down, but it didn't vanish entirely. They lay twined in one another's arms, even as Hannibal's knot slackened, his seed seeping out to wet the blanket. They couldn't stop kissing, touching, shaken by the knowledge of how close they had come to losing it all. It seems I have been proven wrong in my declaration, Will whispered, smiling against his husband's mouth and stroking his face. While not those of Hertford House, I am now thoroughly acquainted with one carpet at last. Hannibal chuckled, the sound rumbling in his belly in a pleasant vibration against Will's own.
Should we revisit the Turkish monstrosity when we return?
He asked, smoothing Will's curls and getting only a sultry smirk in response. He nuzzled Will's nose and sighed, whispering,
I believe Winston has given up on us and decided to keep my feet warm. Perhaps we should seek a more comfortable bed?
Just a moment longer, Will sighed, stretching beneath Hannibal, his toes finding Winston's warm flank curled up close as he dared, now that they'd fallen still. Hannibal gave Will another lingering, devouring kiss before he raised his head to look down at him again, cupping his face with such wonder that Will shivered, covering Hannibal's hands with his own.
I love you, Will,
he said, wanting to say it to him again without the force of their passions masking it. He wanted Will to hear it plainly, to know he meant it, so there would be no doubt in Will's mind on that count.
I don't expect you to return my affections. I don't expect you to ever forgive me. I would never have it be another shackle that binds you to me against your will. I only want you to know that I love you with everything in me.
He drew Will's hands to his heart and held it there, his fingers warm against Will's own. The bond nearly sang with the force of it, a tender, bright note that parted Will's lips on a silent gasp with its strength.
I love you,
Hannibal said again, lifting Will's hand to his lips to kiss it.
And I always will.
Will swallowed hard, struggling against the thickness of tears that closed his throat and stifled his voice. But Hannibal didn't wait for a reply. He didn't expect one, just as he'd said. He kissed Will's parted lips and eased out of him, the sudden loss almost too much after such closeness. The loss didn't last for long, however. Hannibal scooped him up in his arms, rumpled blanket and all, whistled Winston to his heels, and carried Will up to his bed, content to love his mate as he deserved and hoped that one day he could be loved in return.